The certified letter trembled in my hand as I stared at the impossible figure. $50,000 in HOA fines for unauthorized modifications to my property. They demanded payment within 30 days, threatening legal action and property liens. What Oak Ridge Estates' power-hungry board didn't realize. The private road everyone used to enter this exclusive neighborhood sat squarely on MY land, and I had just rediscovered the forgotten property deed in my grandfather's safe. Before we start the story, please comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel for more HOA stories. When my grandfather, Frank Miller, passed away last summer, I never expected his modest ranch-style home on the edge of Oak Ridge Estates to become both my salvation and the center of a neighborhood war. After losing my apartment in the city due to skyrocketing rent, inheriting his paid-off house seemed like perfect timing. The property needed work. Decades of my grandfather's temporary fixes had left it functional but outdated, but the location just outside the prestigious Oak Ridge Estates neighborhood made it worth every creaking floorboard. Your grandfather was quite the character, Mrs. Donovan, the elderly neighbor next door, told me as I unloaded my moving truck. Always kept to himself but knew more about this place than anyone. Shame how the neighborhood changed around him. I didn't understand what she meant until my third week there. While tearing out the worn kitchen cabinets, I discovered a hidden metal box tucked behind the ancient plumbing. Inside were yellowed property deeds, handwritten letters, and faded surveys dating back to the 1960s. Late that night, surrounded by dusty papers spread across the living room floor, I pieced together a surprising history. My grandfather hadn't just owned this house. He'd once owned most of the surrounding land, including what was now Oak Ridge Estates. He'd sold parcels to developers decades ago, but according to these documents he'd retained ownership of one crucial piece: Mason Road, the only paved access route into the exclusive community. The current deed still listed this private road under his name, with only a limited easement granted for resident access. There was never any formal transfer to the HOA that now governed the neighborhood with an iron fist. Well, I'll be damned, I whispered to myself, studying a county survey map from 1973 with my grandfather's signature in the corner. The property line was unmistakable. Mason Road belonged to the Miller family. To me. I tucked the documents away, not thinking much of this quirky inheritance detail. After all, what practical difference could owning a road make? I was more focused on making the house livable and settling into my new community. Little did I know this forgotten piece of family history would become my only leverage when the Oak Ridge Estates HOA decided to make my life a living hell just 2 months later. My first real introduction to the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association came 3 weeks after moving in, when a sharp knock interrupted my Saturday morning coffee. Opening the door, I found myself face to face with Karen Westfield, HOA president, a title she announced before even offering her name. "We're so pleased to have new blood in the neighborhood," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes as she handed me a thick binder. "This contains all our community guidelines. Though technically your property sits just outside our official boundaries, we do consider you part of the Oak Ridge family." The binder contained over 60 pages of rules covering everything from acceptable mailbox designs to approved tree species. As I flipped through it, Karen pointed to my grandfather's old pickup truck parked in the driveway. That vehicle would typically violate Section 12.3 regarding visible work vehicles, but since you're still settling in and technically outside our jurisdiction, consider this a friendly heads-up rather than a violation notice. I nodded politely, though something about her tone made the hair on my neck stand up. "Thanks for stopping by. I'll keep this in mind." After she left, I noticed a man photographing my front yard from the sidewalk. When I approached him, he introduced himself as Dennis, the HOA's compliance officer, just documenting the neighborhood aesthetics. That evening my doorbell rang again. This time it was Ray Henderson, my neighbor from 2 doors down. "Saw Karen making her rounds?" he said with a knowing look. "Thought I should warn you, they've been getting particularly strict lately. 3 families moved out last year because of the fines." "But my grandfather told me this property isn't even part of Oak Ridge," I replied. Ray sighed. "Technically true, but they've been pushing boundaries. Your grandfather knew how to handle them. Kept them at arm's length. Ever since Karen became president, the board's been trying to bring outlying properties under their control. Over the next few weeks, I received 4 courtesy notices for minor issues: my grass being half an inch too tall, a garden hose visible from the street, the wrong shade of white on my porch trim, and having trash cans at the curb 15 minutes past the allowed time. Though annoying, I tried to maintain peace. I adjusted what I could and politely pushed back on the rest, reminding them of my property's independent status. Just trying to maintain neighborhood standards, Karen explained during one phone call. Your grandfather understood the importance of property values, even if he wasn't officially under our jurisdiction. What I didn't tell her was that several original residents had quietly approached me with stories about my grandfather. How he'd stood his ground against previous HOA boards. How he'd helped neighbors appeal unjust fines. How the road maintenance had always been mysteriously handled whenever the HOA became particularly aggressive. The tension remained relatively low-key until I decided to finally tackle the property's outdated exterior. That's when things escalated from annoyance to all-out war, and when my grandfather's carefully preserved documents became much more than just family history. Spring arrived with a vengeance that year, turning my grandfather's weathered property into an eyesore practically overnight. The ancient gutters couldn't handle the downpours, the faded siding looked even more decrepit next to the neighbors' freshly painted homes, and the crumbling front steps had become a genuine safety hazard. Time to bring this place into the current century, I told myself, sketching renovation plans at the kitchen table. Unlike the Oak Ridge McMansions with their cookie-cutter aesthetic, I wanted to honor my grandfather's craftsman bungalow style while modernizing its functionality. I did everything by the book. Had architectural plans drawn up, applied for county permits, and even hired Greg Thompson, a respected local contractor who'd worked in Oak Ridge Estates previously. With approvals in hand and a reasonable timeline of 3 months, we broke ground in early April. You might want to give the HOA a courtesy heads-up, Greg suggested on our first day, eyeing Karen's house down the street. They don't technically have jurisdiction, but they'll make noise regardless. I took his advice, emailing the board a summary of our approved plans along with the county permits. Karen's response came within the hour. While we appreciate the notification, all exterior modifications in our community require HOA Architectural Committee approval. Please suspend work and submit the proper forms. Just ignore it, advised Greg when I showed him. You've got county approval and they know you're not actually in their jurisdiction. They're just flexing. The first week went smoothly. We removed the damaged siding, replaced rotting support beams, and prepped for the new windows. Then Dennis appeared with his camera, meticulously photographing every aspect of the construction from various angles, always careful to stay on public property. By week 2, certified letters began arriving. Notice: unapproved construction materials on property. Warning: excessive noise during non-designated hours. Violation: contractor vehicles parked on street overnight. Though irritating, I continued the work. The county inspector visited twice, approving each phase and commenting on the quality of Greg's craftsmanship. This is some of the best restoration work I've seen, she noted. You're actually improving the neighborhood's character. Then came the drone. I first noticed it hovering over the backyard where we were replacing the deck. The small white quadcopter maintained a steady position about 30 feet up, its camera clearly directed at our work. That's crossing a line, Greg muttered, waving his hat at it. When I called Karen about it, she denied any knowledge but added, "The Architectural Committee does have the right to document potential violations using available technology." The final straw came when water service to my house mysteriously stopped mid-project. The utility company found the valve at the street had been manually shut off, not by their technicians. That evening, I received an email with multiple attachments from photos of my renovation alongside a list of alleged code violations that would significantly impact neighborhood property values. As I scrolled through the images, many clearly taken from angles impossible from public property, my phone rang. It was my bank, calling about a strange letter they'd received questioning the financing of my renovation and suggesting potential fraudulent activity on my construction loan. I hung up, hands shaking with anger, and pulled out my grandfather's metal box from the closet. It was time to understand exactly what rights I had, not just to my house, but to the road everyone in Oak Ridge Estates used every single day. The next morning, I called my cousin Sarah, a real estate attorney in the city. I needed professional help before things got worse. I had no idea that worse would arrive in my mailbox just 3 days later, in the form of a certified letter demanding $50,000 in cumulative fines. Retry. Claude does not have internet access. Links provided may not be accurate or up to date. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because I'd just finished my shift at the hospital and was still wearing scrubs when I signed for it, the mail carrier's sympathetic glance making me uneasy before I'd even opened the envelope. Inside was a 5-page document on Oak Ridge Estates HOA letterhead, with "Notice of Accumulated Violations" emblazoned across the top in bold red letters. The first paragraph stopped me cold. After thorough documentation and board review, the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association has determined that your property at 1742 Mason Road is in violation of multiple community standards and covenants. The total assessed penalties amount to $50,000, due within 30 days of this notice. My legs gave out, forcing me to sit on the front steps as I flipped through page after page of itemized violations, each with its own penalty. Unauthorized structural modifications, $15,000. Non-compliant exterior materials, $12,500. Improper drainage affecting community property, $8,000. Excessive construction duration, $7,500. Repeated noise ordinance violations, $4,000. Contractor parking infractions, $3,000. The final page contained the most chilling paragraph. Failure to remit payment in full by June 15 will result in the immediate filing of property liens, potential legal action, and the revocation of all community privileges, including access restrictions where legally permissible. I called Sarah immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. $50,000? She repeated after I explained the situation. That's beyond excessive even for an overzealous HOA. And they absolutely cannot restrict your access. That's crossing into illegal territory. They mentioned revoking community privileges, I said, still trying to process the magnitude of their demands. You're not even officially part of their community, Sarah reminded me. Forward me everything they've sent. Don't respond to them yet. That night I couldn't sleep. The renovation had already stretched my finances thin. I'd used most of my savings and taken a modest construction loan. There was no way I could pay this outrageous fine, but the threat of property liens terrified me. The next morning I tried reasoning with them directly, calling the number listed on the letterhead. Karen answered personally. We've been more than patient, she said, her voice coldly professional. The board unanimously approved these penalties after months of documented violations. But my property isn't even part of Oak Ridge Estates, I argued. Your HOA has no legal jurisdiction over my renovation. That's actually incorrect, Karen replied with unsettling confidence. Your grandfather signed a provisional agreement in 1998 acknowledging adherence to community standards given the property's location at the neighborhood entrance. The board has recently voted to enforce these long-standing provisions. It was a lie, I was certain of it, but her conviction made my stomach twist. I'd like to appeal at the next board meeting, I requested, trying to keep my voice steady. The decision is final, I'm afraid. But you're welcome to submit questions in writing for board consideration. With that, she ended the call. That afternoon, as I sat shell-shocked at my kitchen table surrounded by renovation material samples that now seemed like ridiculous luxuries, there was a knock at my door. It was Ray, my neighbor, looking uncomfortable. I heard about the fine, he said quietly. Karen announced it at last night's meeting as a victory for neighborhood standards. Most of us were horrified at the amount. Can they actually do this? I asked. Ray hesitated. They've never gone this far before, but 3 board members are real estate agents who've been pushing to clean up properties near the entrance. Your renovation is independent-minded. They want everything matching their aesthetic. As Ray left, I noticed Dennis parked across the street, photographing our interaction. The intimidation was becoming unbearable. That night, I pulled out my grandfather's metal box again, this time emptying every single document onto the dining room table. There had to be something here that could help me fight back. At 2 a.m., I found it, not just the property deed to Mason Road, but a detailed history of easement disputes, carefully documented by my grandfather over decades. According to these records, not only did I own the only access road into Oak Ridge Estates, but the HOA had attempted similar overreach 3 times before. Each time, my grandfather had quietly reasserted his ownership rights, keeping detailed records of the proceedings. For the first time since receiving that devastating letter, I felt a glimmer of hope. I took photos of everything and sent them to Sarah, then fell into an exhausted sleep, my mind already formulating a plan that would make the Oak Ridge Estates HOA deeply regret their $50,000 mistake. This changes everything, Sarah declared, spreading my grandfather's documents across her downtown office table 3 days later. I'd taken a personal day from work to meet with her, bringing the entire metal box of records. Sarah had arranged them chronologically, creating a timeline that spanned nearly 50 years. Your grandfather was meticulous, she observed, examining a faded easement agreement from 1974. And surprisingly strategic. Look at this clause here. He specifically retained the right to modify access conditions with reasonable notice. As we pieced together the history, the full picture emerged. When the developers first purchased my grandfather's land to create Oak Ridge Estates, he had insisted on keeping ownership of Mason Road, the only viable access point due to the creek running along the neighborhood's western edge. The developers agreed because they needed his land, Sarah explained. They figured they'd eventually pressure him into turning over the road to their newly created HOA. But my grandfather had outsmarted them. The easement he granted was carefully worded, giving Oak Ridge residents the right to use the road while maintaining his ultimate control. He even included provisions for maintenance cost sharing that the HOA had apparently been ignoring for years. And look at this, Sarah said, pointing to county records from 2005. They tried to claim adverse possession of the road, but your grandfather filed the proper notifications to prevent it. He was paying attention when nobody else was. I stared at his neat handwriting in the margins of legal documents. Third attempt to claim road ownership. Resolved through letter from Stevens and Burke attorneys, May 2005. So I really do own their only access road? I asked, still struggling to believe it. Sarah nodded, pulling up the county's GIS property mapping system on her computer. According to these official records, absolutely. Mason Road remains registered to Frank Miller's estate, which now belongs to you. The easement allows for residential use by Oak Ridge residents but doesn't transfer ownership rights. She continued scrolling through documents. What's fascinating is how your grandfather handled previous conflicts. He never blocked access or created public drama. He simply reminded them of his legal position and suggested mutual cooperation. But this $50,000 fine is way beyond what he ever faced, I pointed out. True, Sarah agreed. And that threat about access restrictions were legally permissible, in their letter? That's ironic given you're the one who could legally restrict their access, not the other way around. We spent the afternoon consulting with Jim Barton, a colleague of Sarah's who specialized in property disputes. He confirmed our understanding and added valuable context. HOAs derive their power from property deeds and covenant agreements, Jim explained. Since your property never had those deed restrictions and sits outside their boundaries, they have zero authority to issue fines or demands. What about their claim that my grandfather signed some agreement in 1998? I asked. Jim shook his head. If it exists, they would need to produce it. But given the thorough records your grandfather kept, I strongly doubt he signed anything surrendering his independence. More likely, they're bluffing or referring to some neighborhood courtesy agreement without legal teeth. By late afternoon, our strategy was taking shape. Sarah started drafting a formal response to the HOA, while Jim filed requests for additional county records to further solidify our position. As I drove home, a weight lifted from my shoulders. The $50,000 threat still loomed, but now I had something more valuable than money: leverage. That evening, I walked the length of Mason Road, seeing it through new eyes. This wasn't just asphalt and concrete. It was my grandfather's legacy, his quiet way of maintaining independence while coexisting with neighbors who sometimes forgot the value of being good community members. When I returned home, there was another certified letter waiting, this one a final notice reducing my response time to just 14 days, due to the severity of ongoing violations. I smiled as I placed it unopened on top of my grandfather's metal box. Their aggressive timeline had just made our response that much more satisfying. The next step was to gather witnesses who could testify to the HOA's pattern of overreach, and according to Ray, there were plenty of current and former residents eager to help. We need a strategy that accomplishes two goals, Sarah explained over coffee at my kitchen table a week later. First, we decisively end their harassment of your property. Second, we establish clear guidelines for the road ownership going forward. Ray had joined us, along with 3 other Oak Ridge residents who'd faced their own HOA battles. Eleanor, a retired judge who'd successfully fought off landscaping fines. Mike, whose home-based accounting business had been targeted by Karen's no commercial activity crusade. And Diane, who'd nearly lost her house after a medical emergency left her temporarily unable to maintain her yard to HOA standards. They count on intimidation, Eleanor observed. Most people either pay the fines or move rather than fight. I spread the county maps across the table, Mason Road highlighted in yellow. According to these records, not only do I own the road, but there's a 10-foot easement on either side that's also my property. Mike whistled. That includes their precious entrance sign and those pretentious pillars. I don't want to become the neighborhood villain, I clarified. I just want them to back off and acknowledge they have no authority over my property. The challenge is leverage, Sarah explained. While you legally control the road, practically speaking, you can't just block access. Emergency vehicles need to get through, and preventing residents from reaching their homes could create liability issues. What about a formal road maintenance agreement? Ray suggested. Your grandfather's documents show the HOA was supposed to contribute to upkeep costs but stopped years ago. Sarah nodded. Perfect starting point. We calculate reasonable maintenance fees retroactive for, say, 5 years, not the full backlog since that would be excessive. We could also formalize future expectations, Eleanor added. A binding agreement that prevents HOA overreach while ensuring road access. Over the next 3 hours, we hammered out a comprehensive proposal. 1. Immediate rescinding of all fines against my property. 2. Written acknowledgement that my property sits outside HOA jurisdiction. 3. Payment of reasonable road maintenance fees, $15,000 for 5 years of neglected contributions. 4. A new easement agreement with clear terms and limitations. 5. HOA bylaw amendments preventing future board harassment of non-member properties. This seems fair, Diane remarked, reviewing our draft. You're not being vindictive, just establishing boundaries. And what if they refuse? I asked. Sarah smiled. Then we moved to Plan B, a formal notice restricting road use to residential access only, with no HOA signage, no landscaping on your easement, and a requirement that they establish secondary emergency access through adjacent properties. That would cost them hundreds of thousands, Mike said wide-eyed. Which is why they'll likely accept Plan A, Sarah explained. It's designed to be the reasonable alternative. We spent another day gathering supporting evidence. Photographs of the road's condition, estimates for proper repairs, testimonials from residents about HOA overreach, and detailed property surveys confirming my ownership. The timing needs to be strategic, Sarah advised. We should present this at their monthly board meeting where other residents can witness the exchange. According to Ray, the next meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community clubhouse, exactly 1 day before their final notice deadline for my $50,000 payment. As our planning session wrapped up, Mike handed me a thumb drive. Security camera footage from my front porch, he explained. Shows Dennis and Karen entering your property while you were at work last month. Might come in handy. Eleanor patted my hand. Your grandfather would be proud. He never used his leverage to bully anyone, just to maintain balance. That's what we're doing here. That night, after everyone left, I sat on the front porch looking down Mason Road toward the Oak Ridge entrance, its manicured landscaping and ornate sign illuminated by spotlights. For decades, my grandfather had quietly maintained ownership without conflict. Now I would need to be more direct, but hopefully just as fair. I drafted my presentation for Thursday's meeting, focusing on mutual respect rather than threats. The HOA had started this war, but I was determined to end it with a peace treaty that respected everyone's rights. As I worked, a car slowed in front of my house, Karen's silver Mercedes. She didn't stop, just drove by slowly watching. I smiled and waved. Thursday couldn't come soon enough. Thursday evening arrived with an unexpected summer storm. Thunder rolled across the sky as I pulled into the Oak Ridge Estates clubhouse parking lot, my portfolio of documents protected inside a waterproof messenger bag. Sarah had insisted on accompanying me, and her reassuring presence in the passenger seat helped calm my racing heart. Remember, you're not asking for permission, you're offering a solution, she reminded me as we watched residents hurrying through the rain toward the building. Stay calm, stick to facts, and let the documents speak for themselves. The Oak Ridge HOA meetings followed a strict format that Karen ran with parliamentary precision. Residents could only speak during the designated public comment period, limited to 3 minutes each. Board discussions and votes happened afterward, with no further input allowed. We arrived 10 minutes early, but the room was already packed. Word had evidently spread that something dramatic might unfold. I spotted Ray, Eleanor, Mike, and Diane scattered strategically throughout the audience. Nearly 60 residents filled the chairs, an unprecedented turnout according to Ray's whispered update. Karen noticed our entrance immediately, her eyes narrowing as Sarah placed our materials on the table. The 6 board members sat elevated on a small platform, name placards positioned before them like judges. We have a full agenda tonight, Karen announced precisely at 7 p.m., tapping her gavel. Please hold all comments until the appropriate time. 4:45 excruciating minutes, they proceeded through routine business, approving previous minutes, discussing seasonal flower selections for common areas, and debating a proposed rule about permissible holiday decoration periods. Finally, Karen reached compliance enforcement actions on the agenda. A slideshow began showing various properties with alleged violations. My house appeared on the third slide, with major violations, enforcement pending superimposed across multiple images of my renovation. Property 1742 Mason Road continues its unauthorized reconstruction despite multiple notices, Karen stated flatly. Final collection proceedings will begin tomorrow unless full payment is received. Excuse me, I said, standing up despite Sarah's cautionary touch on my arm. Since you're discussing my property, I'd like to address the board. Karen's smile didn't reach her eyes. Public comments are at the end of the meeting. Please be seated. Actually, Sarah interjected, also rising, since you're taking formal action regarding this property, the owner has the right to respond before any vote occurs. State Property Code 47.3b is quite clear on this point. A murmur ran through the crowd as Karen conferred hastily with Dennis and another board member. Very well, she conceded with obvious reluctance. You have 3 minutes. I approached the front, placing my grandfather's original property deed on the document camera. The image projected onto the screen, replacing Karen's violation slideshow. Thank you for allowing me to speak. I'm here to address 2 issues. First, your claim of authority over my property, and second, a long overdue discussion about Mason Road. The deed filled the screen with my grandfather's name and property boundaries clearly visible. As this county-registered deed confirms, my property at 1742 Mason Road has never been part of Oak Ridge Estates. It carries no HOA covenants, no membership obligations, and is not subject to your architectural guidelines or fines. I clicked to the next document, the original developer agreement from 1973. More importantly, this second document establishes that Mason Road itself, the only access route to Oak Ridge Estates, remains private property originally owned by my grandfather and now transferred to me through his estate. The room erupted in confused chatter. Karen banged her gavel repeatedly. This is irrelevant to the violation notices, she insisted, but her voice had lost its authority. On the contrary, Sarah interjected, it establishes the fundamental lack of jurisdiction for any notices or fines. But please continue, she added, nodding to me. I switched to the county GIS map, showing property boundaries in official colors. As you can see, Mason Road and a 10-foot easement on either side remain registered to the Miller property. The HOA has an access easement for residential use, but ownership and ultimate control remain with me. Dennis leaned forward, his face flushed. If you're suggesting you can restrict access to our homes. I'm not suggesting anything of the sort, I interrupted calmly. Unlike the HOA, I have no interest in using technicalities to threaten my neighbors. I'm simply establishing facts before proposing a mutually beneficial solution. The next slide showed photographs of the road's deteriorating condition. According to the original easement agreement, the HOA was to contribute to maintenance costs proportional to usage. These payments stopped in 2008 without explanation. Karen's composure finally cracked. This is absurd. That road has always been community property? I finished for her. No, it hasn't. My grandfather maintained it quietly for years because he valued being a good neighbor. He addressed previous HOA overreach privately, but your $50,000 fine forces me to be more direct. I placed our proposal on the document camera. Here's what I'm offering: a formal road usage agreement that guarantees uninterrupted access for all residents, establishes fair maintenance cost sharing, and most importantly, clearly defines the boundaries of HOA authority. The room had grown completely silent. In exchange, I expect immediate rescinding of all fines against my property, written acknowledgement of my independent status, and payment of reasonable back maintenance fees totaling $15,000, significantly less than the $50,000 you're demanding from me. I looked directly at each board member. I'm not interested in controlling my neighbors or imposing arbitrary rules. I simply want to renovate my home in peace and establish a respectful relationship moving forward. Karen started to speak, but Eleanor stood up from the audience. As a retired judge, she announced, I've reviewed these documents and can confirm their legal validity. I strongly advise the board to consider this reasonable offer. Others began standing, Ray, Mike, Diane, and then surprisingly more residents I'd never even spoken with. Let's vote on it now, someone called from the back. Karen's face had gone from red to ashen. This requires legal review and... Then I suggest we adjourn to executive session immediately, the HOA treasurer interrupted, looking alarmed. We should discuss this privately before proceeding. As the board members huddled at the front, Residents surrounded me with questions and, surprisingly, words of support. They fined me $500 for planting unauthorized rosebushes last year. They tried to force me to remove my basketball hoop even though it's completely on my property. This might finally bring some balance to how things are run around here. After 15 tense minutes, the board returned. Karen looked defeated as Dennis whispered furiously in her ear. "The board will take this proposal under advisement," she announced stiffly. "We'll respond formally within 7 business days. This meeting is adjourned." As people filed out, many stopped to shake my hand or offer encouragement. Sarah gathered our documents looking pleased. "They're going to accept," she predicted quietly. "They have no choice." Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the air fresh and clear. As we walked to my car, I noticed Karen standing alone by her Mercedes, staring at the Oak Ridge entrance sign that, as we just established, sat squarely on my property. Our eyes met briefly across the parking lot. I nodded once, neither gloating nor angry, just acknowledging the new reality between us. The $50,000 threat that had kept me awake for weeks now seemed like nothing more than a paper tiger, its power dissolved by the truth my grandfather had carefully preserved all these years. 7 days after the dramatic HOA meeting, Sarah and I sat in my newly renovated kitchen, reviewing the board's formal response that had arrived by certified mail that morning. "They're stalling," Sarah observed, tapping the 3-page letter. "They've acknowledged your road ownership but proposed a 90-day study period before taking any action on the maintenance fees or rescinding the fines. So they're ignoring our deadline," I said, disappointment settling in my stomach. Sarah shook her head. "Not ignoring, testing. They want to see if you're willing to enforce consequences." We had anticipated this possibility. The board's response was polite but non-committal, filled with legal jargon and references to complex historical arrangements requiring thorough review. The only concrete action they proposed was creating a joint committee to explore road ownership implications, effectively delaying any real resolution for months. "It's time for your ultimatum," Sarah decided. "We've been reasonable. Now we show them you're serious." That afternoon, I hand-delivered sealed envelopes to each board member's home. The letter inside was brief and unambiguous. To the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association Board. Your response fails to address the fundamental issues raised in my proposal. Therefore be advised. 1. Within 48 hours, all fines against my property must be rescinded in writing. 2. Within 7 days, a payment of $15,000 for past road maintenance must be deposited into the escrow account established with Sarah Chin, attorney at law. 3. Within 14 days, the proposed road access agreement must be signed as presented. Failing these actions, on May 30th at 7 a.m., I will exercise my property rights as follows. All non-resident vehicles will be prohibited from using Mason Road, all HOA signage and decorative elements will be removed from my easement. Contractors will begin installing property boundary markers, access will be limited to residents, emergency vehicles, and essential services only. I take no pleasure in these measures but will not hesitate to implement them if necessary. This letter has been delivered to all Oak Ridge residents to ensure transparency. Ray helped distribute copies to every household in the neighborhood, a task that took us well into the evening. By midnight, my phone was buzzing with text messages and calls from concerned residents. The next morning, a crowd had gathered at the Oak Ridge entrance. Karen and Dennis stood with a group of supporters, while Ray, Eleanor, and several dozen other residents formed a larger group across from them. The neighborhood had physically divided over the dispute. "This is unnecessary escalation," Karen announced as I approached. The board was prepared to negotiate in good faith. 90 days isn't negotiation, it's delay, I replied calmly. "I've tried to be reasonable." An older gentleman pushed forward from Karen's group. "I've lived here for 20 years. You can't just threaten to cut off access to our homes." "I don't want to restrict anyone's access," I explained. "I want the board to stop harassing my property and acknowledge boundaries that have existed for 50 years. "Then why threaten us?" someone called out. Eleanor stepped forward. "He's not threatening residents, he's holding the board accountable. They've been exceeding their authority for years, and now they're facing consequences." The crowd's mood was shifting. More residents began asking questions directly to Karen and Dennis. "Did you really try to fine him $50,000? Is it true you've been ignoring the road maintenance agreement? Why are we just now hearing about this property boundary issue?" As the board members fumbled through evasive answers, I noticed several residents walking away shaking their heads. By that afternoon, A petition was circulating calling for an emergency community-wide vote on my proposal. It quickly gathered signatures from over 70% of households, well above the threshold required by the HOA bylaws. That evening my doorbell rang. It was Thomas Grayson, the HOA vice president, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Off the record," he said quietly, "several board members disagree with Karen's approach. We've called an emergency board meeting tomorrow. I believe we can find a solution before your deadline." The next day, an official email went out to all residents announcing an open board meeting that evening. When Sarah and I arrived at the clubhouse, nearly every resident was present. Karen was notably absent. Dennis explained she had prior commitments, but had authorized the board to pursue reasonable compromise. After just 30 minutes of discussion, the board voted unanimously to accept my proposal in its entirety, with one modification. They requested a joint committee to oversee road maintenance decisions moving forward, ensuring mutual input on future projects. As residents applauded the resolution, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. This hadn't been about winning a power struggle, it had been about restoring balance and mutual respect to a neighborhood my grandfather had helped create. The transformation of Oak Ridge Estates began almost immediately after the board signed our agreement. Within days, violation notices disappeared from front doors throughout the neighborhood. The drone that had regularly monitored properties was nowhere to be seen, and Dennis resigned from his position as compliance officer. The most visible change came 2 weeks later when residents gathered for a Saturday community workday, the first in Oak Ridge history. Together we repaired potholes on Mason Road, trimmed overgrown trees along the easement, and refreshed the entrance landscaping. Karen remained conspicuously absent from these activities. According to neighborhood gossip, she had listed her house for sale and was spending weekends house hunting in another community. While some residents expressed satisfaction at this development, I felt no pleasure in her departure. The goal had never been to drive anyone away, just to establish reasonable boundaries. The Joint Road Committee proved surprisingly effective. We established a transparent maintenance schedule and created a dedicated fund using the $15,000 payment plus ongoing contributions from HOA dues. For the first time, residents could see exactly how their money was being spent. More importantly, the HOA board structure itself evolved. At the next regular election, residents voted in new bylaws requiring rotating board positions, transparent decision-making and reasonable caps on fines. Eleanor was elected president, with Ray serving as treasurer. "Your grandfather would be proud," Mrs. Donovan told me one evening as we chatted across our adjoining yards. "He always said communities work best when everyone remembers their neighbors first and property owners second." The renovation of my house continued without further interference. Greg and his crew finished the exterior work by late summer, preserving the craftsman character while modernizing its functionality. When the scaffolding finally came down, several neighbors stopped by to compliment the results. "It actually enhances the neighborhood entrance," Thomas Grayson admitted during the final inspection. "The architectural diversity adds character we didn't realize we were missing." As for the $50,000 fine, the board formally rescinded it with a written apology acknowledging their lack of jurisdiction. The certified letter now hangs framed in my home office. A reminder that standing up for yourself doesn't have to mean creating new enemies. Spring returned to Oak Ridge Estates, bringing with it the first anniversary of what residents now jokingly called the Road Revolution. The community had gathered for a neighborhood picnic on the newly created common green space, formerly an unused patch of HOA-owned land that had been transformed into a vibrant community garden and gathering area. "Hard to believe how much has changed in just a year," Ray commented as we helped set up tables for the potluck dinner. Indeed, the transformation went far beyond physical improvements. Property values had actually increased by an average of 8%, contradicting Karen's dire predictions about aesthetic inconsistency harming the market. 3 new families had moved in, attracted by what real estate listings now described as a community-centered neighborhood with balanced governance. The most significant change was in how neighbors interacted. Front porches that had sat empty for years were now regular gathering spots. Children played freely in yards without parents anxiously measuring grass height or worrying about toy visibility from the street. Eleanor's leadership as HOA president emphasized community building over rule enforcement. Reasonable standards remained in place, but they were applied with flexibility and communication rather than rigid penalties. "We've found the middle ground," she explained during her informal State of the Neighborhood address. "Property values matter, but so does actually enjoying where we live." Karen had indeed sold her house and moved to a stricter, gated community across town. Dennis had followed shortly after. While a few residents still grumbled about declining standards, the vast majority embraced the new balance. As for me, my grandfather's house had truly become mine over the past year. The renovation had preserved its character while making it comfortable for modern living. I'd planted his favorite variety of dogwood trees along the driveway and restored the workshop where he'd spent countless hours tinkering. Most importantly, I'd inherited not just his property but his approach to community, standing firm when necessary but always seeking solutions that benefited everyone. Mason Road remained under my ownership, but the Joint Maintenance Committee functioned so smoothly that most residents forgot about the unusual arrangement. The road had been completely repaved that spring, with improved drainage and subtle lighting that enhanced safety without creating light pollution. As the neighborhood picnic wound down that evening, I found myself sitting with Mrs. Donovan and several original residents, listening to stories about the early days of Oak Ridge Estates. "Your grandfather used to say that good fences make good neighbors, but only if both sides agree where the fence belongs," Mrs. Donovan recalled. "He never wanted control, just respect." Looking around at children playing freely, neighbors chatting across property lines, and a community that had rediscovered the meaning of its name, I realized we had finally found that respect, not through bylaws or threats, but through remembering that beneath all the property deeds and rules, we were simply people sharing a small piece of the world together. The metal box of documents now sat on my office shelf, rarely opened but always present. A reminder that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't the property itself, but the wisdom to know how to protect what matters while letting go of what doesn't. As the sun set over Oak Ridge Estates, casting long shadows across Mason Road, I silently thanked my grandfather for leaving me not just a house and a road, but a lesson in finding strength in unexpected places, and using it with both courage and compassion.